The dawn of the virus. The world awoke to a silent, insidious invader known as the virus. It didn't announce its presence with the usual signs, a fever, a cough, or any physical discomfort. Instead, it crept in quietly, insinuating itself into the very fabric of human existence, evading detection for far too long. At first, there were no visible signs. People carried on with their lives, blissfully unaware of the subtle shift occurring within them. It was a virus that bypassed every medical diagnostic tool, slipping past the scrutiny of even the most vigilant healthcare systems. It settled into its hosts, biding its time, its effects as invisible as the virus itself. Unbeknownst to anyone, this virus held a peculiar design, unlike anything seen before. Its effects lay dormant, operating quietly beneath the surface, infiltrating the core of humanity itself. It targeted an intrinsic aspect of human identity, gender, and sexual orientation. This wasn't just a virus of the body, it was a virus of the mind, of the self, striking at the heart of what it meant to be human. The unseen symptoms. In the early days, there was no sign that anything was wrong. People continued to live their lives, unaware of the silent changes taking place within them. But soon, anomalies began to surface, small at first, but growing in number and severity. Individuals who had once exuded vibrant sexuality and emotional warmth began to exhibit a stark disinterest. Couples who had shared deep, passionate connections found themselves drifting apart, the warmth of intimacy replaced by an inexplicable apathy. The world, once fervent with passion, began to cool. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a decline in libido, it was a complete disintegration of sexual identity. Those who had been confident in their gender and orientation began to question themselves, feeling a disconnect that they couldn't explain. Medical experts were baffled. There were no clear symptoms, no diseases to combat, no apparent threat to life. But the impact was undeniable. People were losing something fundamental, something that defined their very humanity. Yet the cause remained a mystery, the virus invisible and elusive. The disintegration of society. As the virus spread, the effects rippled through society, growing more profound with each passing day. Relationships began to crumble as the bonds that once held people together disintegrated. Marriages fell apart, and families fractured under the strain. The virus didn't just attack individuals, it attacked the very foundation of human society. Birth rates plummeted as people lost interest in sex and reproduction. The desire for intimacy, for connection, faded into obscurity. Governments around the world began to panic as the population declined, with no clear end in sight. The implications were staggering, an entire species on the brink of self-inflicted extinction. The scientific community, initially baffled by the virus, now raced against time to understand its origins and mechanisms. Researchers from every corner of the globe worked frantically to identify the pathogen responsible for this silent epidemic. But despite their best efforts, the virus remained elusive. No test could detect it, no treatment could reverse its effects. Families watched in horror as their loved ones transformed, their identities dissolving into nothingness. The world began to change in ways that no one had anticipated. Industries tied to family life, child rearing, and sexual wellness faced collapse. Schools, once filled with the laughter and energy of children, grew quiet as the birth rate continued to decline. The economy, too, began to falter as the workforce shrank, leaving industries desperate for labor. And through it all, the virus continued its relentless march, spreading from person to person, leaving devastation in its wake. The world was changing, and not for the better. The regression. But the worst was yet to come. 15 years after the first cases were reported, the virus revealed its final, devastating effect, regression. Those touched by the virus began to regress, not in age, but in emotional and sexual maturity. Adults who had once been fully functional members of society now found themselves slipping into a childlike state, their memories fading, their identities dissolving. The regression was gradual at first, marked by subtle changes in behavior and cognition. Adults who had once been highly capable and independent began to exhibit childlike tendencies. They became easily confused, their language skills regressing to that of a young child. Over time, they lost the ability to care for themselves, becoming entirely dependent on others for even the most basic needs. As the regression progressed, the afflicted lost all sense of who they were. Their memories faded, their relationships disintegrated, and their identities vanished. They were left in a state of perpetual vulnerability, a tragic shell of their former selves. Society, ill-equipped to comprehend, let alone care for these individuals, faced an unprecedented challenge. How could the world cope with the loss of so many, reduced to the mental state of 5-year-olds? The regression was irreversible. There was no cure, no treatment that could halt or reverse the process. And as the years passed, the number of those affected continued to grow, placing an unbearable strain on the healthcare systems and social services. Families were torn apart as loved ones became strangers, their identities wiped away by the virus. Parents watched in despair as their adult children regressed to a state of childlike dependence. Spouses became caretakers, watching helplessly as their partners lost everything that made them who they were. The collapse of civilization. As the virus continued to spread, civilization began to crumble. The institutions that had once supported society, marriage, family, education, the workforce, were falling apart. Schools, once bustling with activity, now stood half empty. The children who remained were often raised by parents who were themselves regressing, creating a generational disconnect that further eroded the bonds of society. The workforce, too, suffered as more adults regressed to a childlike state, unable to perform their jobs or contribute to the economy. Entire industries collapsed, and governments struggled to maintain order in the face of a rapidly shrinking and increasingly dependent population. The social safety nets, already stretched thin, were overwhelmed by the sheer number of people in need of care. The world, once vibrant and full of promise, now seemed to be in the grip of a slow and inevitable decline. The streets, once filled with the bustle of daily life, were now eerily quiet as people withdrew from the public sphere. The sense of community and shared purpose that had once bound society together was eroding, replaced by a growing sense of isolation and despair. Governments around the world implemented measures to try and mitigate the effects of the virus, but it was too little, too late. Quarantines, lockdowns, and travel bans did nothing to stop its spread. The virus was everywhere, affecting every corner of the globe. The final years. As the years passed, the grim reality of the virus's effects became impossible to ignore. The virus didn't bestow immortality on those it afflicted, it merely delayed the inevitable. At the age of 60, those affected would face a painful and tragic demise. Abandoned, forgotten, and starved, they would succumb to a fate no human should endure. The final years of an afflicted individual's life were a heartbreaking spectacle. As they regressed further into childhood, they became increasingly frail and vulnerable. Their physical health deteriorated, and they were often left to languish in institutions that were ill-equipped to care for them. Those who had once been pillars of their communities were now reduced to mere shadows, forgotten by the world they had once helped to build. The end, when it came, was neither swift nor merciful. The virus, having stripped its victims of their identities, now exacted its final toll. Their bodies, weakened by years of neglect and malnutrition, could no longer sustain life. Death came slowly, accompanied by a deep sense of loneliness and abandonment. For many, it was a fate worse than death itself, a slow, agonizing descent into oblivion. By the time the first wave of those afflicted reached the age of 60, the world had already been changed beyond recognition. Society had been hollowed out, its structures crumbling, its people lost in the fog of the virus. There was no one left to mourn the dead, no one left to remember the world that had once been. The aftermath. In the end, there was no recovery for humanity. The toll of the virus was not just measured in lives lost, but in the complete and utter collapse of civilization. The virus had taken everything, people, relationships, societies, and left behind nothing but emptiness. Those who survived were not the lucky ones. They were the witnesses to the slow, agonizing death of the world. They watched as everything they had known and loved was stripped away, leaving behind only a hollow shell. There was no hope, no future, no possibility of rebuilding. The world had been irrevocably changed, and there was no going back. The survivors wandered the desolate landscape, searching for something that no longer existed. They were the last remnants of a dying species, clinging to life in a world that had already moved on. The virus had won, and humanity was its final victim. There were no more governments, no more societies, no more families. The world was a barren wasteland, devoid of life and hope. The survivors, if they could still be called that, were left to wander in search of something, anything, that could give their lives meaning. But there was nothing left. The virus had taken everything. And so, the world faded into darkness, the last remnants of humanity lost in the shadows. The virus had come silently, insidiously, and it had left just as quietly, taking with it the very essence of what it meant to be human. There was no recovery, no redemption, no hope. The world was empty, and it would remain that way forever.